Bright flashes of green lit up the sky, like a distant beacon flickering on and off. They were faint but unmistakable. We all made jokes about aliens while setting up our tents, laughing and teasing each other. I was certain there were 6 of us. We had been friends since elementary school, and this camping trip to Redwoods National Park was our way of celebrating our high school graduation. The green flashes eventually faded as we chatted and worked on our tents. Mike was the first to finish setting up his tent and announced he was going to gather some firewood. I recalled how we had worked together at the local grocery store last year, making the night shifts much more bearable. Meanwhile, Alex was in the corner, still engrossed in his tent manual, fiddling with his square glasses. I wasn't as close to Alex as I was to the others, but I remembered copying his homework in history class once. Rachel and Laura, my cousin, were working together on a tent. I had plenty of memories of them hanging out at school. Rachel's younger sister used to tag along with us everywhere. I mention all this because I know there were 6 of us, including me, and I knew everyone in our group. Mike went off to gather firewood while the rest of us unfolded our chairs and set them around the fire pit. As the sun set and darkness enveloped the forest, I began to feel uneasy. The shadows of the trees stretched longer and longer as the minutes passed. Alex fetched a flashlight from his bag, and we wondered aloud what was taking Mike so long. Soon, we heard the rustling of bushes announcing his return. By then, we were all huddled in our chairs, wrapped in our jackets as the temperature dropped and a breeze picked up. "Couldn't you guys at least set up a chair for me?" Mike joked as he placed the branches in the fire pit. We had set up 6 chairs around the fire. I tried to make sense of it, but my mind felt muddled, like I was underwater. I had been so clear-headed until that moment, but when I tried to figure out why 6 chairs were occupied even though Mike hadn't sat down yet, my thoughts just slipped away, like something was pulling them out of my head. I instinctively felt more uneasy, and then I realized why. The entire forest had gone silent. I glanced at the others and could tell they felt it too. Alex was fidgeting, scanning the group, trying to spot the extra person, but it was futile. I looked at each face, all etched with worry and frustration except for. "It's all right. I'll get the chair myself," Mike said, breaking the silence and easing the tension a bit. I stood up to help him. He looked into my eyes and nodded knowingly. We walked towards the tents, but I kept glancing back at the group. "How many people are here?" I whispered to Mike, who then noticed that we had indeed only packed 6 chairs. Each person had brought their own chair. They were too heavy to carry extras. "There's 6, right? I mean, there are 6 chairs," Mike replied, his voice wavering. "No, I think maybe one of us forgot our chair," I said, struggling to address the issue head-on. My mind sought rational excuses instead, but it felt like swimming in a dream. And when I tried to think about who the 7th person was, my head throbbed. "Yeah, that sounds about right," Mike said, relaxing as we headed back to the group. When we returned to the fire pit, 2 chairs were empty, one for me and one for Mike. Everything seemed to make sense again, even though it hadn't before. Laura suggested we were just tired from the long hike and needed sleep. She might have been right. We were all exhausted from waking up early to get here. Rachel brought out the drinks, and we emptied the whole pack. We moved closer to the fire for warmth, sipping on our cans and reminiscing about the past year. Rachel was in the middle of telling us about the time she was home alone, with weird things happening in her house when I suddenly felt chills despite the fire's warmth. What had felt cozy moments ago now felt wrong, because I realized I had missed something crucial. "Who started the fire?" I asked, interrupting Rachel's story and breaking everyone's immersion. Everyone looked momentarily annoyed until they realized they had no answer. Once again, I scanned the faces staring back at me, all barely illuminated by the firelight, all familiar and pale from fear. "Wasn't it you, Mike?" Alex asked. Mike shook his head. "I think the person standing behind Jess did it. Laura said, looking at me. I whipped my head around so quickly it hurt. My heart was pounding in my ears. There was nothing behind me except the darkness of the woods. Staring at those tall, dark trees made me feel exposed. I felt like a lost bird in a vast field. Wait, I don't know, Laura said. Her eyes were wide, and she was visibly shaking. She continued to look around frantically as Rachel moved over to her, placing her hands on her shoulders and trying to calm her down. I think we should leave, Rachel stuttered. Yeah, something just doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on it, Mike said. But it's so dark out in the forest now. We'd probably get lost if we leave, someone else said. Yeah, I think we should stay the night and leave as soon as we can tomorrow, Alex agreed. I tried to protest but realized Alex was right. The woods harbored an oppressive darkness, making navigation nearly impossible. Let's not sleep in our separate tents, just to be safe, Laura said. We all agreed. We only brought one-person tents, but we could squeeze two in if we tried. That way, no one would be alone at night. Following this conversation, we all got up and made our pairs. I went with Mike, and Laura, as always, went with Rachel. Alex kept complaining that he didn't have a pair, but we reassured him he did. He wouldn't accept it. I feel like at some point, we all realized there were only 6 of us, and suddenly we were all huddling in the middle of the clearing. Why do we keep thinking there are 7 of us here? Alex asked, sweat dripping down his face despite the cold. We had nearly left him all alone under the assumption there was another person. My stomach turned as I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to mentally recap everyone here. My head throbbed, but I kept pushing it. There's me, Mike, Alex, Rachel, Laura, and I pointed at each of them as I said their names. I retched and emptied the contents of my stomach on the ground when I got past Laura. The left side of my head felt like a knife was stuck in it. My vision was blurry. Mike held me up to stop me from collapsing, and we all wordlessly started to move towards the tents as someone put the fire out. Mike helped me into a tent while the others discussed what to do. I could only focus on snippets of the conversation as the excruciating pain in my head came and went in waves. Laura had the brilliant idea of arranging 3 tents together, so their openings faced each other at right angles in a sort of U shape, so we could sleep as close as possible and also limit the entrance to our tents. Mike was about to help as they worked outside, but I clutched his hand and asked him to stay with me. The tents took some time to arrange. I started to feel a bit better once everyone got settled into their tents. A quick head count confirmed there were 6 of us. Alex would have to sleep in his tent alone, but he seemed more comfortable with it, since all the tents were very close now. Looking back, I think he was just trying to put on a brave face for us. I regret that moment deeply, letting him sleep in his tent alone. He was always less integrated into our group and knew none of us would pair with him. Just before going to bed, we all agreed to leave as soon as the sun rose. I remember taking one last look outside the tent into the forest before trying to fall asleep. The wind had picked up, and the tree branches were swaying gently. Beyond our clearing was pure darkness. It felt like the trees were closing in on me. With the faint moonlight illuminating our clearing, I turned my head to look at the 2 tents we had left out and saw someone standing next to them. Despite the circumstances, sleep came quickly and easily. Rachel's shrill scream woke me up in the middle of the night. Mike and I ripped our tent door open to find Laura and Rachel looking into Alex's tent. We pushed them aside. Alex's sleeping bag was rolled up. He was still inside it, his head in the center, face contorted in utter agony. The rest of his body was wrapped around it, the blue fabric now dripping with dark blood. Mike zipped up the door of the tent. Rachel was in shock, her eyes glassy and unfocused. Laura was shaking her repeatedly, tears streaming down her face. Mike picked up his torch and yelled at us to get up and run. We left the campsite behind and entered the trail we had come from. The 6 of us huddled together, Mike leading in the front as he cast his weak flashlight over the path so we could see it. All we had to guide us through the 2-hour trail was a small white circle of light. Even the moon failed to illuminate our surroundings through the dense foliage. Rachel tripped and fell, twisting her ankle. We came to a stop. Someone said they knew how to splint it so we could keep going. They dragged Rachel away from us into the darkness. Laura screamed after her. Mike and I tried to drag Laura back to the light of the torch, but we were both flung back by something in the dark. Our torch fell, and as I scrambled to retrieve it, Mike's voice suddenly cut off. All I could hear was Laura sobbing and something dragging on the forest floor. I retrieved the torch and pointed it at where Mike had been standing. There was nothing there. Mike, Rachel. I shouted, but I couldn't hear anything besides Laura sobbing. I grabbed her by the wrist, hoisted her up, and ran. My feet ached, but I didn't care. As we kept running, I knew the 6 of us had no chance. I had to keep going for Laura. Please, Laura panted. Wait, I can't run anymore. We need to keep going, I urged, but she didn't listen. The wind howled, shaking the leaves on the trees as we stopped. We need to rest. She stammered between heavy breaths. Her face was pale and glistened with sweat. I realized she was right, and we rested under a large oak tree. I checked my watch. We had been running for 20 minutes. Laura's eyes widened as she stared at something behind me. I turned around to see what it was. In the distance, standing between 2 trees, was a dark figure. I pointed the torch at it, but the light didn't seem to reach. It just stood there, motionless. Is it watching us? Laura whispered. I don't know, I replied, my voice shaking. We have to keep moving, she said, grabbing my hand. We stood up and continued down the path, our pace much slower now. I kept looking over my shoulder, but the figure didn't seem to follow us. It just stood there, watching. Eventually, we saw the entrance to the park up ahead. The sun was starting to rise, and the first light of dawn pierced through the trees. We ran the last stretch and burst out of the forest, gasping for breath. We collapsed on the ground, relieved to be out of the woods. We never found the rest of our friends. The authorities searched the area, but found no trace of them. To this day, I can't explain what happened. All I know is that something in those woods didn't want us there. Last but not least, just don't forget. For more afterlife tales, hit that cross. Oh, sorry, I meant subscribe button.